Dropping bombs on targets was a difficult challenge following the end of World War I. While the years afterwards saw bombs and planes growing bigger and better, actually landing a bomb on target was still a complicated and mostly guesstimated affair, even with primitive bomb sites. For attacking cities, as the heavy bomber was envisioned to do, this was mostly fine, especially when accounting for the volume of ordnance that was to be dropped on such targets. For attacking smaller, possibly moving targets, however, this was impractical. A different approach was needed, and thus a different approach was found. Enter the dive bomber. Instead of dropping bombs from level flight and trusting in Kentucky windage to guesstimate where it hit, a plane could carry a bomb and dive from high altitude at near vertical angles on the target, simplifying the geometry involved and giving the pilot a clear view of the target to adjust and fine-tune their aim. Only small, specialized planes could, however, pull this off, as the stresses, speeds, and g-forces experienced by the airframe and pilot would be immense, requiring special consideration in the aircraft's design to withstand the dive and very rigorous training for the pilots to keep them alive and conscious during the maneuver. While many countries developed dive bombers during the interwar period, one country, ran by people wearing spicy pinwheels, arguably produced the most iconic one. So iconic, in fact, that its premier dive bomber has become the plane used as an example of what a dive bomber is, and has permanently ingrained itself into our cultural zeitgeist by its sound alone. I speak, of course, about the Ju-87 Stuka. The Stuka's origins are slightly disjointed, with the principal designer, Herman Pullman, working on aircraft that could be considered Stuka-related as early as 1928 with the Ju-48. This early work and consideration for keeping a dive-bombing aircraft robust would lead to Herman discarding a retractable landing gear in favor of the one that was fixed and instead aerodynamically faired to reduce drag, a hallmark feature of the Stuka. But it is not till 1933, with Ernst Udet becoming infatuated with dive-bombing as a tactic, after flying a Curtiss Goshawk, that the Stuka as we know began to take shape in the Studersbomber program. The original Stuka was a weird thing, having a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, a split twin rudder to allow better fields of fire by the tail gunner, and being built in Sweden as a workaround to the Treaty of Versailles. The first prototype, Ju-87 V1 4921, took to the air on September 17, 1935, after being smuggled into Germany right under the League of Nations' nose in late 1934. The first flight was a success, with only a minor issue in cooling for the engine. When it came time to test out the actual diving part of this new dive bomber on January 24th of 1936, the twin rudder arrangement proved to be too weak to endure the stresses of the dive, coming undone mid-flight and leading to a crash that killed Juncker's chief test pilot. The second prototype Stuka would inherit the painful lessons learned from this and have a standard reinforced rudder replace the twin rudder setup, as well as hydraulic dive brakes under the leading edge. One issue that, however, required more immediate attention was the RLM, and their incredible disinterest in the Stuka due to its usage of the Rolls-Royce Kestrel. Juncker suggested a Daimler-Benz DB600 to replace the Kestrel, which, after some negotiation and analysis, led to the Junkers UMO 210 being selected as the Stuka's new power plant, since it was more available than the DB600, which was being rationed for fighters like the Bf-109. The decision, however, garnered concern from evaluator Wolfram von Richthofen, who found the new Stuka to be underpowered. As luck would have it, however, Heinkel, who was competing against Junkers for the dive bomber contract, had their submission, the Heinkel 118, encounter a rapid, unplanned disassembly while Ernst Udet was flying it, with the 118's propeller deciding that staying attached to the engine was a suggestion rather than a requirement. After a safe delivery to the ground via parachute, Udet declared the Stuka the winner of the program, citing its earlier flight where not only did its propeller stay attached, but it endured a vertical dive with no trouble at all that would have seen the poor 118 undone. Continued development would center around trying to solve the underpowered nature of the Stuka, but it was never fully addressed even with stronger engines later down the line. Introduction to service would be in 1936 with the Ju-87A, which can be identified by the massive aerodynamic fairings over the landing gears, compared to the frankly conservative ones found on the more famous B variant. Stukas would see combat for the first time in skies over Spain, though very few would actually be sent to the Condor Legion to help the nationalists during the war. Despite their low numbers, they handled themselves adequately, providing accurate bombing and giving invaluable experience. One portion of experience they however lacked was the Stuka's handling of a contested sky, as the nationalists had air supremacy by the time the Stukas arrived. Poland would be the next theater the Stukas flew, and escaped the wrath of the Polish Air Force courtesy of the ruthless efficiency of the German war machine, with reportedly only 31 Stukas being lost during the entire Polish campaign, though no clarification as to the sources of these losses is provided. Norway was next on the chopping block, with Stukas performing anti-shipping and some close air support operations to great effectiveness. Their anti-shipping efforts in particular were alarmingly effective, with many smaller ships like the HMS Black Swan or the French destroyer Bison being heavily damaged or outright sunk by Stuka attacks. So ferocious indeed were the Stukas that the Royal Navy had to back off outside of their range, which rendered their carrier operations from the HMS Glorious and HMS Ark Royal insufficient for supporting the Allied troops. After Norway, it was France's turn, and while Stukas continued to operate exceptionally well if left unimpeded by any aerial opposition, when aerial opposition did rear its ugly head, the Stuka was little more than a flying target. On the 12th of May near Sedan, 6 French 875s, export variants of the venerable Curtiss Hawks, intercepted and savaged a flight of 12 unescorted Stukas en route to their target. They claimed 11 kills without a loss of their own number, with German records admitting to at least 6. Though the Allied air operations over France were sparse and disorganized due to the rapid advance of German forces, the few fighters that did fly, the ones not shot down by Bf-109s at least, made mincemeat of both the Heinkel 111 and the especially slow, lumbering Stuka, somewhat foreshadowing of events to come. Despite the higher losses Stukas took during the fall of France, it wasn't enough to raise concerns, especially as German forces pushed through Paris like a speed bump and corralled the British Expeditionary Force, alongside the remnants of the Belgian and French armies, around Dunkirk. When the weather permitted, Stukas bombed any ship they could trying to get the Allied forces across the Channel. But the weather was horrific, and particularly low cloud cover made dive bombing impossible. On the very few good days that the clouds broke and they were able to fly, the losses incurred by the evacuating Allied forces from Stuka attacks were particularly high. The Royal Air Force assigned to protect the evacuating soldiers suffered the same weather issues, as well as spotty, insufficient coverage to fully protect the evacuation effort. With Poland, Norway, and France all under Germany's heel, all that remained now was the tiny isle nation across the Channel, Britain. If the pace of the previous 3 campaigns were any indicator, it wouldn't take long for the German war machine to grind them to dust. Thus, on August 13th of 1940, Eagle Day, Stukas departed from their bases, slipped past the distracted RAF fighters tangoing with the Bf-109s, and bombed RAF Detling and other assigned targets to absolute shreds. 20 RAF aircraft and most of the airfield structures were cratered, with the Stukas returning home and looking forward to another sortie the next morning. But come that morning, as Stukas took off from their bases in France and set off towards Dover to bomb a radar station, their gunners looked up to realize in horror that flying high above them was not their fighter escort, because they didn't have a fighter escort this sortie, meaning the silhouette they saw now getting concerningly close was...
Help yourself, everybody. There's no fighter escort.
The Stuka in the previous 3 campaigns were supported and escorted by friendly fighters, allowing easy skies to operate in. Left on its own, however, as it was over the skies of Britain with the rest of the Luftwaffe tangoing with the RAF, they became a tally mark for many British fighter pilots. Between August 8th and August 18th, the hardest day, over 20% of all Stukas the Germans had were gone, relegated to the past tense and as statistical data. The loss of aircraft themselves would have been bad enough, were not also the loss of the trained and battle-hardened aircrews that flew them. And this was just the Stuka fleet, to say nothing of the Bf-109s and Heinkel 111s that were similarly mauled by Britain's premier integrated air defense system. In exchange for astronomical losses, the Stukas had sunk 6 warships, primarily destroyers and outdated cruisers, 14 merchant ships, damaged 7 airfields, 3 radar stations, as well as 49 aircraft on the ground. With the severe beating of biblical proportions the Luftwaffe was given, most Stukas were thus redeployed to Poland in preparation for Operation Barbarossa. Again, much like the previous 3 campaigns, the Luftwaffe would establish air dominance over the VVS and allow the Stuka to operate with impunity at first, providing invaluable close air support to ground forces as they pushed eastwards towards and eventually up to Stalingrad. At their height, the Stukas managed near 500 sorties for the loss of 1 Stuka every single day. But this was their last hurrah. Though the later D variant that brought a new engine in, and the G variant that fitted AT cannons to the wings were well liked by Stuka pilots and proved effective against Soviet armor, the VVS, after a rapid reorganization, had taken back the initiative against the Luftwaffe and would chew up the remaining Stukas so badly that 3 of the Stuka squadrons were re-equipped with ground attack Focke-Wulfs after Operation Citadel, with Stukas growing concerningly sparse in the Luftwaffe's inventory given production had ended in 1944. The total count of Stukas produced amounts to somewhere around 6,000 aircraft, but today only 3 Stukas remain in the world, 2 static displays and 1 being restored to theoretically flying condition, according to a source from 2018. Of these Stukas, work number 494083 is a G2 variant that was considered for use in the Battle of Britain film in 1969, though it was too costly to get flying and thus passed over for scale models instead. As for the vast majority of the 6,000 aircraft made, the reason that only 3 today exist is that nearly all of them were shot down and or blown up. Nowadays, though remembered for its absolutely brutal effectiveness in the early years of World War II and being the dive bomber people commonly think when you say dive bomber, it finds a place today in Hollywood and video game developers, all of which being the result of the infamous Jericho trumpets installed as a measure of psychological warfare by the Stuka squadrons. Which, as a last-minute aside, the Jericho trumpet we are familiar with, thanks to Hollywood, is an air-powered siren that uses propellers placed on the landing gears to produce the infamous sound during the dive, produced by the propeller spinning faster as speed increased. The effect of this sound is debated to this day, some saying it only served to give advance warning of the incoming Stuka, others saying it was a harrowing experience that shook them to their very core, and everything in between. What cannot be debated, however, is that the Jericho trumpet has become a very common sight, their sound, in film and video games for the past 7 decades since the war's end, found in any scene where a plane or other modus of transportation was traveling in a downwards trajectory, oftentimes on fire and wildly out of control. Considering the sound effect is still commonly used today and still commonly recognized today, it is very likely that the Jericho trumpet will remain a cornerstone of modern media for decades yet to come.